everyone, it's Mary Brownlee, licensed professional counselor. I have just finished watching the Depp versus Heard Netflix special, and I have some thoughts as a trauma therapist. So while it's still fresh in my mind, I thought I would make a video on it. I found it sad, but also not, unsurprising either, because of the trauma histories of the two individuals that were shared. And while I understand the Netflix show focused on like the legalities and the court case, not too much at least was really shared about mental health and the impact of mental health, and especially trauma histories on human development and relationships and domestic violence. And what we know as trauma therapists, what we're trained in, is the impact of childhood trauma. And they touched upon it a little bit when you saw the two opposing mental health experts that were PhDs, like psychologists. And psychologists do special testing. I'm a licensed professional counselor, so that's a master's degree. And then psychologists obviously have PhDs, so they're a couple more years above our training. And a lot of them do what we call like special psychological assessments, where clients will answer lots of questions to get diagnoses, versus maybe counselors, for example, just use the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. The DSM-5 is what we call it. And I'm very familiar, because of my extensive history treating traumatized populations, very familiar with like borderline personality disorder. I've treated many patients with borderline personality disorder. And I feel like this needs to be said, because I adore my clients with BPD. They are amazing human beings with extensive trauma histories. And I feel like there's a possibility that BPD is already stigmatized. It's already stigmatized. We know that. People commonly think, BPD makes people crazy and reckless and volatile. And while yes, that may be true for some people with BPD, but not necessarily everyone. And there is an extreme depth of suffering that goes along with BPD that is responsible for a lot of the very extensive, like acting out, emotional dysregulation, suicidality, that type of stuff that comes with BPD. But really, BPD is complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and that was not mentioned at all in the documentary. They gave her a PTSD diagnosis, which would make sense, because in the United States here, at least with our DSM-5, complex PTSD is not yet added to our DSM-5. But what it has been added to is the ICD-11. So if you recall from one of my other videos, I talked about the ICD-11 and the difference between PTSD and CPTSD. So complex PTSD actually has a few other variables aside from normal PTSD symptoms, such as trouble like with relationships, volatile emotions, or like emotional dysregulation, like trouble maintaining your calmness, so to speak. Like emotions can really swing wildly based on triggers, more than maybe the average person. But also like identity. So those of us who have been diagnosed with CPTSD have trouble with like identity, and we do have big shame triggers. And this is all based in childhood abuse and trauma. So the difference between CPTSD now and BPD is a little more geared towards the volatility with the emotional dysregulation, and you see more suicide attempts or self-harm, for example, when they get very triggered by something in the environment. Usually relationship distress is usually what triggers it. And then they gave her an extra diagnosis of histrionic personality disorder, which I thought was interesting. But you could see it. You could see it in some of her behaviors and the way she talked. And it made her less believable, of course, because it did seem like she was acting. But I think overall, as a trauma therapist, what I saw was two human beings that both had substance using parents and domestic violence. And so what we know as trauma therapists is when you are a beautiful, innocent baby and young child growing up in a family where you have a parent with a substance use disorder and violence, and no doubt chaos and emotional abuse and verbal abuse and all the other things that go along with it, you damage people's attachment systems. And so that's attachment trauma. And I've talked about that in some of my other videos as well, about how our earliest attachment history with our earliest, caregivers, our parents, can really damage like identity, self-worth. We inherit a lot of those wounds. I've talked about how my favorite method is IFS, which really talks about a lot of those internal wounds based in childhood, like unworthiness, not feeling good enough, shame, self-hatred, not really knowing who you are, right? So this is where those earliest wounds come into play. And I just really saw two adults who didn't have access to authentic self. So I've talked about that in my videos on IFS, how IFS is all about restoring self-leadership, that when we grow up in abusive childhoods, we don't have access to self. And self is that beautifully centered, wise, compassionate part of us that has access to courage and connection and clarity, all those 8 C's that we talk about with self energy. And self really is this wonderful, if we develop self, right, if we have a healthy childhood, self develops naturally and we become an adult with an ability to maintain not only emotional regulation, but to see things clearly and to react with wisdom and to have compassion and empathy. And to really, our life is guided by like this internal compass based on knowing and loving ourselves. And what I really saw was two adults who were essentially grown, wounded children that probably did not have a lot of access to self energy, and both of their wounds just played right off of each other and created this enormous volatility that created so much distress in the relationship. And it's interesting, like, if we are, none of us were there, so we don't know for sure, obviously, but if we're going by, the court case, at least, Johnny was, proven to, essentially be defamed. And so he won the lawsuit. So if we're going by the fact that, it's possible that Amber indeed was, more of the abusive one, that still sets the stage for, Johnny having his own wounds, as I say, driving the bus in terms of him choosing partners that are not emotionally mature or available for him. So that's kind of like a repetition wound that we do when we grow up in abusive families of origin. I've talked about that in one of my other videos as well, when I talked about family systems therapy and how we can do family genograms. And what you see is family trauma just going from great grandparents down to grandparents to your parents to you, and it just goes right on down the family tree, and it's a hot mess. Everybody in the family is a hot mess, basically. You'd be hard pressed to find anybody in the family who did not have some significant level of wounding. And no doubt that is the case for both of these individuals. If I had to hazard a guess, that both Johnny's family and Amber's family, probably extensive family of origin trauma going back generations. So to me, it was just sad. And I didn't like how, abuse becomes so stigmatized. People with mental health disorders can become stigmatized by big cases like this. And I felt like there should be more clarity around the suffering that childhood abuse and trauma causes. We just got a brief glimpse and a window into these two people's lives that clearly had lots of suffering. I think we can all agree on that. And I just found it incredibly sad, because who would these two individuals have been, or any of us, quite frankly, who are abuse survivors? Who would we be, right, if we had had safe, stable, loving childhoods with nurturing parents who were also healthy and had access to that beautiful, wise self energy, because they themselves were also raised by healthy, loving, nurturing parents, right? We probably would never have seen this case. So that's really what stuck out to me, is the recognition that these two individuals were damaged by their families, and then it impacted their choices in partners, and ultimately impacted their marriage and the ending of it, and what we all got to see. And I just feel like more should be talked about in general, in our country, at least the US, and even in the world, the impact of high adverse childhood experiences. So I've talked about that again in another one of my videos, the impact of high ACEs. So ACEs are those adverse childhood experiences on human development, and how we now know, based on the ACE study, that famous ACE study, that extensive childhood abuse and trauma when we're young, under the age of 18, completely changes our brains, completely damages our ability to trust ourselves and know ourselves and love ourselves. It changes the way we relate to other people. Our ability to trust people is damaged. Mental health disorders, we're at much higher risk for mental health disorders. We're at much higher risk for substance using disorders, as a matter of fact. And what we now know too, that we're much more likely also to have adverse health outcomes too. So things like heart attacks and strokes and cancer and whatnot, because chronic high levels of trauma causes high levels of stress hormones to be circulating in the body, which breaks down the body over time. So that's kind of in the nutshell, if we were to talk about the impact of negative childhood experiences going on chronically. It can end in early death. So yeah, so that's kind of the worst outcome for people who have had high ACEs, is that we can die early, much earlier than we otherwise would have. So yeah, I think that's been missed in this whole conversation of Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, is that here we have two individuals that are really showing the world the very sad and devastating impact on human beings of high adverse childhood experiences. And how all of our lives, if we are abuse survivors, would be so very, very different if we had not suffered from high adverse childhood experiences. And also that I wish that he had talked about treatment, that your life doesn't have to stay volatile and with no hope, for example, to ever be able to relate to other people and trust other people and to have happy relationships and to overcome substance using disorders, for example, because that's entirely possible too. That's what trauma therapists do every single day with individuals such as Johnny and Amber. We work with them to alleviate their suffering and their shame and their self-loathing and improve their sense of identity and their self-worth and their place in the world, and help them restore an ability to find meaning and purpose in life and to heal from those childhood wounds. So yeah, I just wanted to add in my 2 cents in as a trauma therapist, because it was fascinating to watch, but it was actually quite sad for me. And no doubt, if I had to guess, I bet other trauma therapists were probably thinking similar thoughts. So yeah, what has been your thoughts and feelings after watching the Netflix show? Feel free to drop a comment below. I'd be curious to hear what a lot of you are thinking too, and abuse survivors especially too. Did it bring up anything for you? What were your thoughts and feelings as you watched that? I'm sure many of you could relate probably to abusive relationships with similar aspects, and yeah, I'd be very curious. And as always, my heart goes out to any abuse survivor, male or female. Abuse, of course, knows no gender, and I'm just here to tell you that you can absolutely heal and overcome great suffering, and a good trauma therapist is a huge ally in your back pocket of healing. So yeah, feel free to like and subscribe. Your support is so appreciated on my channel. Every like and subscription helps the YouTube algorithm figure it out and get my videos out there. And yeah, I just appreciate all your support, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Take care.